The $10 million figure was announced at a press conference. That is where it entered the public record, through the specific mechanism of a State Department spokesperson reading a prepared statement in a room with cameras, in the language that reward announcements use when they are designed to be heard by the people who have the information being sought and by the broader audience whose awareness of the reward's existence is itself a strategic communication objective. The statement described the reward as available for information leading to the safe recovery of the hostage. It described the hostage in the terms that hostage recovery communications use, carefully with the specific balance between humanizing the individual and not providing information that complicated the negotiation. It described the $10 million in a way that communicated both the seriousness of the American government's commitment and the scale of the value the American government placed on the outcome. The room with cameras transmitted the statement to the people it was designed to reach. None of those people provided the information it was requesting. The hostage remained in captivity for the period that followed the announcement and for a considerable period before it, during which the $10 million figure had existed in various internal planning documents as a ceiling rather than a public commitment, available to be deployed through channels that did not require a press conference, but that had also, across the months of the captivity, not produced the outcome they were designed to produce. What produced the outcome was two men. Not two teams, not two elements. Two operators from the 22nd Special Air Service Regiment who went into the location where the hostage was being held, came back out with the hostage, and completed the operation in a duration that the American professionals who were subsequently briefed on it have described in terms that are consistent across independent accounts and that share a single characteristic, which is the characteristic of descriptions produced by people who know how long these things are supposed to take and who are therefore equipped to understand what it means that this one took the time it did. The specific duration is in the operational record. The operational record is at a classification level. The people who have described it in the terms that constitute the partial public record of the operation have described it without stating the specific figure because the specific figure is in the classification, but they have described it in terms that establish its order of magnitude and that establish it with sufficient precision that the order of magnitude is not in doubt. It was short in the way that the operations that the SAS's training and operational experience are specifically designed to enable are short, which is the shortness produced not by haste but by the elimination of every second between the moment of commitment and the moment of completion that is not required by the task itself. Every second that the task required, not one more. The hostage situation had been running for 214 days before the two men went in. 214 days is the number that multiple sources have confirmed with sufficient consistency to state, and it is a number that requires specific context before it can be understood in the terms the operation's outcome demands. The captivity was not a static situation across those 214 days. It was a situation that had moved through phases, each phase producing a different intelligence picture, a different negotiation framework, a different assessment of the viable paths to resolution, and a different calculation of the risks and costs associated with each path. The intelligence picture had been built and rebuilt across the 214 days by the American intelligence architecture that had made the hostages' recovery its operational priority, and the intelligence architecture that had been applied to the problem was the most sophisticated apparatus for human intelligence collection that the history of American espionage had produced. The CIA had deployed human intelligence resources against the situation from the early weeks of the captivity. The networks it had available in the operational area, networks built and maintained at significant cost and risk across years of operations in environments that had included this one, had been activated and directed toward the specific operational objectives that the recovery required: location intelligence, guard disposition, access routes, the physical condition of the hostage, the decision-making structure of the organization holding them, the internal tensions within that organization that might be exploited through negotiation or through other channels, the relationship between the organization's leadership and the broader networks of alliance and enmity that structured the political environment the organization operated in. All of this had been collected, processed, assessed, and fed into the planning processes that the American response to the captivity had generated. The planning processes had produced options. The options had been reviewed at levels of the American government that the hostages' profile and the political sensitivity of the situation made appropriate. Some options had been assessed as viable, and some had been assessed as presenting risks that the assessment process concluded outweighed their operational advantages. The viable options had been developed into plans. The plans had been presented to decision-makers. Some had been authorized for further development, and some had been set aside. The process was the process that the American system had developed for exactly this kind of situation, and it was a serious and professional process that reflected the genuine institutional capability of an organization that had been managing hostage situations in complex and hostile environments for decades. It had not produced a resolution. 214 days in, and the hostage was still in the location that the intelligence picture had most recently assessed as the most probable current holding site, which was a different location from the location the intelligence picture had assessed as the most probable holding site at the 45-day mark, and the 112-day mark, and the 170-day mark, because the organization holding the hostage had moved their captive at intervals that the intelligence collection had sometimes anticipated and sometimes not. And the not anticipating had twice produced the situation where a plan that had been developed to resolution and was awaiting authorization for execution had been overtaken by a movement of the hostage that the plan had not accounted for. The $10 million announcement had been one of several information operations that the American response had deployed across the 214 days. It was the most visible because it was the most public, but it sat within a broader set of efforts that included back-channel communications through intermediaries, economic pressure on networks associated with the holding organization, and the specific kind of intelligence-enabled signaling that communicated capability without confirming operations. None of it had produced the resolution. The hostage remained in captivity. The intelligence picture remained incomplete in the specific dimensions that a resolution required to be complete. The location intelligence was assessed as credible but not fixed, meaning the confidence level was high enough to act on, but not high enough to guarantee that an action would find the hostage at the assessed location. The guard disposition intelligence was sufficient for planning, but not sufficient for the specific kind of planning that the American professional standard for hostage recovery operations required before authorizing an action. The British element's involvement began at a point in the 214 days that the partial record allows to be placed in the final weeks of the captivity, though the specific timing remains unconfirmed in any public source. The involvement was not initiated through the formal channels of the combined special operations architecture that govern joint operations in the operational area. It was initiated through the informal professional relationships between British and American intelligence and special operations professionals that had been built across decades of combined operations and that functioned in situations where the formal channels were too slow or too visible or too constrained by the institutional requirements of the formal channels themselves as the actual mechanism through which the bilateral relationship produced results. The conversation that initiated the involvement has been described in the accounts of two people who were party to it or adjacent to it, in terms consistent in their substance and careful in the way that descriptions of informal bilateral operational conversations tend to be careful. What the accounts establish is that an American professional whose position in the hostage recovery effort gave him visibility of the current intelligence picture and the current assessment of viable options, communicated to a British counterpart the specific nature of the gap between what the American collection architecture had produced and what the resolution required. The gap was not in the existence of intelligence. The American collection had produced a substantial intelligence picture. The gap was in the specific dimension of intelligence that the British human networks in the operational area had historically produced at a quality and a timeliness that the American collection had not consistently matched, which was the dimension of human access to the specific individuals and networks whose knowledge of the holding organization's operational details constituted the intelligence that a viable action plan required. The British counterpart communicated the American professional's assessment to the relevant element of the British Special Forces and intelligence architecture. The relevant element assessed the situation. The assessment produced a conclusion that the British human intelligence networks in the area had access to sources whose knowledge of the holding organization's current operational posture, including the most current assessment of the hostage's location and the guard disposition at that location, was more specific and more timely than anything the American collection had been able to generate. Acting on that access required a planning cycle shorter than the American planning cycle had been running at, because the source access window was narrow in the same way that all source access windows in that kind of environment were narrow, and the narrow window required action at the speed the window allowed, rather than the speed the American standard planning process required. 2 men. The number is the number that the accounts of the American professionals who were subsequently briefed give consistently, and it is a number that requires the same moment of arithmetic that the accounts describe the American professionals themselves performing. Not 2 teams, not 2 elements, not a supported patrol with a cordon and an entry team and an exploitation element and a quick reaction force. 2 operators from the SAS who went into the location with the specific intelligence that the British source access had produced, operated with the specific methodology that the regiment's training and operational experience had built, and came back with the hostage. The $10 million had not moved the situation in 214 days. 2 men moved it in the time the operation required. The American professionals who received the briefing on the operation's outcome have described the experience in ways that share a specific quality. The quality is not surprise at the SAS's capability, because the American professionals who are in positions to be briefed on operations of this kind are professionals who have spent careers in environments where the SAS's capability is not unknown to them and is not abstractly surprising. The quality is the specific recalibration that happens when something known abstractly becomes known concretely, when a capability that exists in the professional understanding as a general proposition about what the SAS can do becomes visible as a specific set of actions that 2 men took on a specific night against a specific target that 214 days and $10 million had not resolved. The recalibration affects different people differently. Some of the accounts describe it primarily in terms of the intelligence dimension, the specific quality of the British source access that had produced the intelligence picture that the action had been built on, and that the American collection had not produced in the same form across the preceding months. Those accounts are the accounts of intelligence professionals whose frame of reference is the collection problem, and whose recalibration is therefore primarily a recalibration of their understanding of what human intelligence access of this specific kind could produce when it was present, and what its absence had cost across the 214 days. The cost of its absence is a number that the accounts do not state directly, but that is visible in the 214 days, and the $10 million, and the sequence of plans that had been developed and set aside, and the 2 movements of the hostage that had overtaken plans at the point of execution. Some of the accounts describe the recalibration in terms of the operational dimension, seeing the specific execution by 2 operators of an action that the American planning process would have required a significantly larger and more substantially supported force to authorize against the same target in the same conditions. Those accounts are the accounts of operational professionals, whose frame of reference is the execution problem, and whose recalibration is therefore primarily a recalibration of their understanding of what 2 operators from the SAS's specific training and experience background could execute independently in a hostile environment against a defended target with a hostage present. The presence of a hostage is the variable that makes the operational dimension of the recalibration distinct from the recalibration that a comparable combat operation without a hostage would produce. A hostage recovery operation is not simply a direct action operation with an additional objective. It is a direct action operation in which the additional objective is not additive to the primary objectives, but transformative of them, because the presence of the hostage in the target environment changes the threat calculus, the movement calculus, the discrimination requirement for the use of force, and the contingency planning for every phase of the operation in ways that compound the difficulty of each phase rather than simply adding a discrete additional task. The training for hostage recovery operations is among the most specific and demanding in the special operations repertoire, precisely because the transformation of the threat calculus is not a modification of standard direct action skills, but a fundamentally different application of them that requires its own dedicated training architecture. The SAS had been developing and refining its hostage recovery capability since the Iranian embassy siege in 1980, which had demonstrated to the world and to the British government and to the regiment itself what the specific combination of CQB training, intelligence preparation, and the institutional nerve required to execute a complex multi-room clearance with hostages present could produce when it was applied by operators who had trained for exactly that contingency. The Iranian embassy was the public demonstration. The methodology it demonstrated had been built before it and had been refined after it through every hostage recovery operation, every training cycle in the killing house at Hereford, with scenarios specifically designed to test the discrimination capability that hostage recovery demanded, and every operational deployment in which the operators who had trained the methodology had applied it in environments that tested it against the reality of armed adversaries and civilian presences and the specific conditions that no training scenario fully replicates. By the period the operation this account describes took place, the regiment's hostage recovery methodology had been through 40 years of the specific kind of institutional refinement that only continuous operational application produces. The two operators who went in had trained that methodology to the level that the killing house produced and had applied it in operational environments that the training had prepared them for and that had in turn prepared them further. They were not applying a methodology they had learned in a training program. They were expressing a capability that had been built into them through the accumulated weight of every repetition and every deployment and every lesson that the regiment's 40 years of hostage recovery experience had distilled into the way a trained SAS operator moves through a building with a hostage present and armed adversaries between him and the hostage. The hostage was recovered without injury. The operation produced no SAS casualties. The individuals holding the hostage who presented an armed threat were neutralized with the economy of violence that the SAS close-quarter battle methodology produces, which is not the economy of restraint but the economy of precision, each round placed where the threat required it and not where it did not. The hostage was moved to the extraction point by the two operators who had entered and who extracted with them. The total duration was the duration that the accounts establish as short without confirming a specific. The $10 million remained unspent in the reward account. The State Department spokesperson who had announced it at the press conference was not required to make a subsequent announcement about its disposition because the recovery did not produce the kind of public resolution that the announcement had been designed to support. The recovery was quiet in the way that SAS operations are quiet, which is not simply the absence of publicity, but the presence of the specific operational culture that treats silence about operations as a professional standard rather than a PR preference. The hostage was returned. The people responsible for the captivity knew what had happened to their organization's posture in the area without being told by a press conference. The intelligence that the British source had provided, the intelligence whose quality and timeliness had made the difference that 214 days of American collection had not made, remained protected in the way that intelligence whose sources are still active is required to remain protected. The American professionals who received the briefing on the outcome asked about the source. They asked in the professional way that intelligence professionals ask about sources that produced intelligence they were not getting from their own networks, which is a way that is both a genuine intelligence question and an institutional self-assessment, because understanding what produced the source is the beginning of understanding what the absence of the source had cost and what closing the gap between the two collection architectures would require. The British response to the question was the response that British intelligence gives when the question is about a source whose operational protection requires that the specifics of how the source was developed and what the source's access consisted of are not shared even with trusted partners, which was an answer that acknowledged the source's existence and confirmed its relevance and provided the minimum additional information consistent with the operational protection requirement. The minimum additional information was enough for the American intelligence professionals to understand the category of the gap. The gap was in the dimension of human access that was produced by the specific relationship-building methodology the British intelligence approach had been developing since Northern Ireland, the methodology of patient, say long-term investment in human relationships in specific cultural and geographic environments that produced intelligence access of a depth and specificity that technical collection and more recently established human networks did not generate. The American intelligence architecture had been building toward this kind of access in the operational area and had made progress. The progress had not been sufficient to produce the specific access that the British source represented in the time the 214 days had provided. The $10 million is in an account somewhere. The two men are in the regiment, or were, or have since continued in the careers that service in the regiment produces. The hostage is in whatever life follows the experience of 214 days in captivity and the specific manner of its ending. Sir, the briefing that the American professionals received is in the operational archive at the classification level that governs briefings of this kind. The State Department press conference is in the public record in the way that press conferences are in the public record, available to anyone who knows where to look and who has the context to understand what the $10 million figure was describing and why the description was ultimately rendered archaeological by two men and a narrow intelligence window and the 40 years of institutional refinement that the window required to be exploited in the time the window allowed. The accounts of the American professionals who were briefed describe a moment at the end of the briefing when the operational details had been delivered and the intelligence dimension had been discussed and the specific duration had been confirmed and the force size had been confirmed and the outcome had been confirmed, and someone in the room, whose identity is consistent across two independent accounts of the moment, asked a question. The question was not about the operation. The question was about the $10 million, not in the sense of asking what would happen to the reward, in the sense of asking what the $10 million represented as a comparison to what had actually produced the outcome. The question was the question that the comparison demanded and that the professional register of the briefing had been preventing from being asked directly for the duration of the briefing, and the person who asked it in the specific tone of a professional who has decided that the professional register is not serving the truth and that the truth requires the question to be asked. Nobody answered it directly. It did not require a direct answer. The answer was in the room in the form of the briefing that had just been delivered. In the 214 days, and the $10 million, and the two men, and the duration, and the outcome, and the 40 years of institutional refinement that had produced the two men, and the source, and the intelligence window, and the operation that had resolved in the time it took while the reward account remained unspent, and the press conference remained in the public record, and the 214 days remained in the operational archive, as the period during which the most sophisticated intelligence collection enterprise in the world had been working the problem, and the answer had been two men from a regiment in Hereford, and a source in a British network, and a window that the two men had been trained for 40 years to exploit. The question hung in the room. The briefing ended. The $10 million is still in the account. The individuals responsible for the captivity understood what had happened to them before any official communication confirmed it. This is one of the consistent elements across the accounts of people who had knowledge of the operational aftermath. And it is the element that carries a specific kind of evidentiary weight in the assessment of what the operation achieved, because the response of an adversary to what has been done to them is the clearest possible evidence of what has actually been done to them. The organization holding the hostage knew, within hours of the operation's completion, that they had been penetrated by an intelligence capability they had not identified and reached by an operational capability they had not been able to defend against. They knew this not because anyone told them, but because the evidence of both was in the result. Their security had not detected the approach. Their guards had not produced a warning that would have allowed the organization to move the hostage before the entry. The intelligence that had placed two operators at the correct location at the correct time with the correct picture of the disposition inside had been sourced from somewhere in their environment, and they had not found it. The response this produced in the organization is the enemy as mirror evidence that makes the operational record say something that the operational record does not say directly. The organization changed its procedures, not gradually, in the way that organizations change procedures in response to accumulated experience. Immediately, in the way that organizations change procedures when they have experienced something that has revealed a fundamental vulnerability in their current approach. The specific procedure changes have been documented in the intelligence reporting from the area in the period following the operation, and the documentation is in systems accessible to the people whose clearances include that reporting and not accessible to the people whose clearances do not. What is accessible through the accounts of people who have had access to the reporting is the general character of the changes, which was the character of an organization responding to the realization that its human security, the network of relationships and loyalties and access controls that it relied on to prevent intelligence penetration, had been breached by a methodology it did not understand and could not directly counter. The response included changes to how the organization communicated internally, which was a response to the assumption that the intelligence penetration had included a communications dimension that it had not in fact included, but that the organization could not rule out. It included changes to the geography of the organization's operations in the area, withdrawals from locations and relationships that had been active for extended periods on the assessment that their continued use created vulnerability, and it included, most revealingly, an internal inquiry that the intelligence reporting documented the existence of, whose purpose was to identify the source of the penetration and whose conclusion, as reflected in the subsequent reporting, was that the source had not been identified. That conclusion is the clearest evidence in the operational record of what the British source methodology had produced. An organization with sophisticated internal security that was specifically designed to prevent human intelligence penetration had been penetrated in a way that its own internal inquiry could not trace. The source had survived the inquiry not because the inquiry was inadequate, but because the source development methodology had built the access in a way that the standard counterintelligence procedures of the holding organization were not designed to detect. The source was still active in the period when the organization was conducting the inquiry. The inquiry's failure to identify the source was itself reported back through the intelligence channel that the source was part of, which meant that the intelligence architecture knew the inquiry had failed before the organization had finished conducting it. This is the dimension of the British intelligence contribution to the operation's outcome that the $10 million comparison most obscures, because the $10 million was a reward for information, a payment model built on the assumption that the information would come from a source motivated primarily by the financial incentive, and the source that produced the intelligence the operation was built on was not that kind of source. The British human intelligence methodology did not produce sources who reported for financial incentives alone. It produced sources whose access was the product of years of relationship development, whose reliability was the product of the specific kind of trust that years of relationship development created, and whose survival was the product of the tradecraft discipline that the British intelligence training had built into the handling of the source, and that the source itself had been prepared to apply to its own behavior. The $10 million was designed to produce a different kind of source, a source whose existence in the environment was incidental rather than cultivated, who happened to have access to relevant information and who could be motivated to share it through the financial incentive. This kind of source existed in the environment and had been contributing to the American intelligence picture throughout the 214 days. The picture the American collection had built was genuine and valuable, and had been the foundation on which the British source intelligence had been able to be interpreted and acted upon. Without the American collection picture as context, the British source intelligence would have been harder to assess and slower to act on. The two intelligence methodologies were complementary rather than competing, and the outcome was a product of both rather than a demonstration that one was superior to the other. What the outcome was a demonstration of was the specific capability that produced the operational result from the intelligence, which was not the intelligence itself, but the two men who acted on it. And the two men who acted on it were the product of a system that the $10 million could not have bought, and that the American intelligence collection could not have generated, and that the 214 days of the captivity had not been able to match with anything the American operational architecture had available in the operational area at the time the window opened. The killing house at Hereford was where part of the explanation lived. Not the whole explanation, but the part of the explanation that was most specific to the hostage recovery dimension of the operation, the part that distinguished two operators from the SAS from two operators from any other special operations organization that might have been available in the operational area, was the killing house. 40 years of hostage recovery scenarios, each one designed to test a specific element of the discrimination requirement that the presence of a hostage inside a building with armed adversaries imposed on every aspect of the CQB sequence: the entry, the initial room clearance, the identification of the hostage among other individuals whose status was not immediately visible, the neutralization of the armed threat without the collateral risk that the proximity of the hostage to that threat in the confined spaces of a building created, the securing of the hostage and the transition from neutralization to protection that the building clearance required to happen simultaneously with the continuation of the clearance. These are not skills that can be approximated. The discrimination requirement in hostage recovery is binary. The hostage is protected or the hostage is not. There is no partial protection, no score on a spectrum, no operational outcome, that is acceptable on the grounds that the discrimination was mostly correct. The requirement is absolute, and the training for it therefore has to be absolute, which means it has to be conducted under conditions that test the discrimination to its limit, at the ranges and in the room configurations, and under the time pressures and with the threat variabilities that the operational environment produces, until the discrimination is not a skill being consciously applied, but a pattern of perception and response that operates below the level of conscious control with the speed and the precision that the absolute requirement demands. The 40 years of killing house training since the Iranian embassy had produced operators for whom the discrimination was that pattern. They did not consciously discriminate in the hostage recovery scenario. They perceived and responded. The perception and response were the product of thousands of repetitions in configurations designed to make the discrimination harder at each iteration, and the product was two men who could enter a building with a hostage present and armed adversaries between them and the hostage, and complete the recovery in the time the operation required without the hostage being harmed and without the discrimination being wrong in the direction that harm required. The briefing that the American professionals received contained the operational detail that confirmed this. The positions of the individuals inside the location at the time of entry, the proximity of the armed individuals to the hostage, the specific configuration of the space that the entry team had to navigate between the breach point and the hostage, the discrimination decisions that the configuration required and the speed at which those decisions had to be made, the round count that the neutralization of the armed threat had required, and the absence of any round that had not been required. Each element of the operational detail was the specific kind of evidence that a briefing on a hostage recovery operation presents to professionals who understand its significance, and the professionals who received it understood its significance in the terms that their own training and operational experience made available to them for understanding it. They asked their questions. The questions were professional and specific and deserved the specific answers they received. The briefing ended. Someone asked about the $10 million. Nobody answered directly because the answer needed no voice to reach them.